The first time I heard the Atlantic breathe, I thought it was the wind, but it wasn't. It was the groan of steel under pressure, the whisper of salt against hull, the sigh of a convoy that wouldn't make it. And then, silence. Imagine you're aboard the SS Ceramic, November 1942. You've just finished your shift, the coffee's gone cold in your hand, and your breath fogs the narrow corridor as you head toward the galley. A distant thud, then another. Before you can scream, blackness. The Ceramic never resurfaced, nor did 655 souls who believed the night was safe. That's how it was in the Atlantic. No trenches, no uniforms you could aim at, just shadows, and shadows that killed. Churchill called it the only battle that truly frightened him. Not Stalingrad, not Normandy, the Atlantic. Because here, the enemy was invisible, and every hour lost was a soldier unfed, a tank undelivered, a plan delayed. Every convoy wasn't just steel and crates, it was time. Time Britain couldn't spare, time the Axis was desperate to steal. Now, imagine trying to fight that. No gunfire to chase, no flags to capture, just a ripple on the water, a periscope, a breath before oblivion. That's the paradox. You had the mightiest fleets, radar advancements, Allied unity, and still you were losing to ghosts. Because the real weapon of the German U-boat wasn't the torpedo, it was fear. Each ship that vanished into the waves wasn't just a casualty, it was a message. You're not safe. You're never safe. And behind every attack, there was a doctrine, a man, a mind. Admiral Dönitz, the man who believed submarines could win wars, not just battles, who saw the Atlantic not as an obstacle, but as a hunting ground. But before we dive into his wolf packs, let me ask you something. How do you defend a battlefield that has no front? How do you strike back at an enemy who leaves no trace? How do you win a war where silence itself becomes the sound of defeat? The Atlantic didn't bleed like Europe. It drowned quietly, relentlessly. If you want to hear more untold stories like this, subscribe now so you don't miss the rest of this journey through history. And every day it did, the Allies got closer to losing the war without ever seeing the enemy's face. But Dönitz wasn't the only predator in those waters. There were others, waiting, watching, and hunting in packs. But what made his strategy so terrifying was what came next. Cold, black, and infinite. That's how the ocean looked from the conning tower of U-96. Lieutenant Jürgen Müller had been awake for 36 hours, scanning the horizon through a salt-streaked periscope. His knuckles were white from gripping the controls. He knew they weren't alone, but he couldn't see them yet. Only the hum. Low, faint, but growing. He exhaled slowly, and just beneath that breath, the doctrine unfolded. Not one U-boat, not a lone hunter, a pack. 8 submarines fanned out in crescent formation, sweeping towards convoy HX-229 like wolves drawn to the scent of weakness. Each one silent, each one waiting, and the moment a single ship was spotted, the pack closed in. That's what Dönitz envisioned. Not naval combat, but a ritual hunt. He wasn't just a tactician, he was a conductor of dread. What he created wasn't just a military strategy, it was psychological warfare in salt water. His Wolfpack doctrine rewrote the rules, coordination through encrypted signals, sudden convergences from different depths, and a level of anticipation that turned every wave into a potential ambush. Imagine being a convoy commander then. You radio for help, too late. One flare shoots up, then fire, then panic, and then static. Dönitz believed that isolation was power, that ships cut off from support would unravel, not just structurally, but morally. His strategy wasn't to outgun the Allies, it was to outweight them, to bleed them slowly, to choke Britain before a single boot touched its shore. But here's the catch. For all his brilliance, for all the terror he unleashed on the high seas, was Dönitz truly a genius or just a gambler? Because every master plan carries its flaw. Every predator meets a counter. And the Allies were learning, adapting, whispering back across the ocean with sonar and code breakers and tactics he didn't see coming. Still, for a time, he was the most feared commander no sailor ever saw. And every sailor who didn't come home felt the edge of his mind before they felt the blast of his torpedoes. So I ask you, was he a visionary or just the first man to realize that silence could be weaponized? The Atlantic wasn't chaos, it was choreography. And the next movement in that dance would reach America's own doorstep. Because not even the glowing skyline of New York could keep the wolves from howling. January 1942. The sky over Manhattan still glowed with light. Jazz poured from open windows. Neon signs blinked defiantly into the night, as if the war belonged to someone else. But beneath that flickering glamour, something stirred. A shadow. And then, steel. U-123 rose like a ghost from the Atlantic deep, barely 50 miles from New York Harbor. Its captain, Reinhard Hartigan, watched the coastline through binoculars with the ease of a tourist. But he wasn't here for the view. He was here to strike. Operation Drumbeat wasn't a raid. It was humiliation. If this moment in history surprises you, give this video a like so more people can discover it too. Germany had brought the war to America's front lawn, brazenly, surgically, and with a twisted kind of elegance. Hartigan's orders were clear: sow panic, destroy morale, and crippled supply routes while the United States still stumbled through the fog of its own arrogance. And that is exactly what he did. Tankers lit up like torches against the night sea. Civilians watched them burn from boardwalks, still in disbelief. The Navy? Understaffed. The Coast Guard? Outgunned. And the cities? Still glowing. Because blackout orders hadn't been enforced. Street lamps and billboards painted perfect silhouettes for torpedoes. America, for all its might, had not believed war would come to its shore. That belief sank faster than the SS City of Atlanta. I remember reading a letter from Ensign Thomas Rivera, one of the lucky ones. He'd just survived a night attack off Cape Hatteras. In pencil-smeared scrawl, he wrote, "We saw them surface like hunters proud of their kill." Think about that. German submarines surfacing after kills to breathe the American air, not hiding, not retreating, announcing themselves. It wasn't just tactical dominance, it was psychological invasion. Hartigan didn't just destroy ships, he desecrated the illusion of distance, the myth that oceans protected. So ask yourself, was it America's lack of readiness that invited the wolves? Or had the U-boats simply become too bold to ignore? One thing is certain. The Atlantic was no longer a battleground in the distance. It had become personal. And that changed everything. Because in war, the loudest alarm isn't an explosion. It's when silence is broken at your door. There's a certain kind of war that isn't fought with bullets, but with silence, with chalk, with wires, with minds that don't sleep. At Bletchley Park, the air smelled of damp paper and ink, a place where mathematics could kill or save without ever leaving a smudge of blood. Alan Turing sat hunched over a machine that sounded like 1,000 keys falling in unison. Around him, rotors spun, clattered, paused, and then alignment. Crack. The Enigma machine, once thought unbreakable, had just whispered a secret. And in that moment, the wolfpacks began to drown, one intercepted signal at a time. But let's not mistake this for a clean reversal. The ocean was still red, the convoys still trembled, only now they trembled with hope, with foreknowledge. Imagine this, a ship captain in the middle of a North Atlantic storm, hearing over his radio a single coded phrase from headquarters. One word, coordinates. And just like that, his convoy veers 10 degrees west. 10 degrees from death. It wasn't luck anymore. It was information. But even the best intelligence needs teeth. That's where the hunters turned hunted. Escort carriers appeared on the horizon like floating hawks, flanked by destroyers pulsing with sonar. Depth charges dropped like thunder from below, tearing silence into shrapnel. And men like Commander Frederick John Walker emerged not as defenders, but aggressors. He didn't just protect convoys, he chased submarines like prey, with patience, with fury, and with a strategy that finally flipped the tide. They called it the support group, but it was really a pack of hounds unleashed. You know what's terrifying? For the first time, U-boat captains began refusing orders. Fear had shifted, and the ocean turned. But that turning didn't come from steel alone. It came from chalk-stained hands, from sleepless nights in windowless rooms, from signals that seemed meaningless until they weren't. So let me ask you, what wins wars? Is it firepower or foresight? Because in the Battle of the Atlantic, the deadliest weapon wasn't forged in iron. It was cracked on paper. And this was only the one of the turning points. Subscribe now so you won't miss the rest of this incredible battle. And just as the Allies began to see through the deep began staring back. The silence inside a U-boat wasn't peace, it was pressure. Not just of steel rivets groaning against water, but of minds trapped. You could smell it. Oil, sweat, the rot of old food and recycled air. No windows, no escape. Just metal walls and whispers of depth. Captain Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock once described it best. We were no longer hunters, we were haunted. And that says everything. By 1943, the tide had turned, not only on charts, but in hearts. Depth charges rained like thunder from above. Not every hit was fatal, but every near miss cracked something inside. A valve, a nerve, a mind. And over time, fear became the true enemy. I remember the account of Obermate Elias Finke. He'd served aboard U-744. They'd been submerged for days, listening to the relentless pings of sonar. No food left, no sleep. One night, he admitted he'd prayed they'd be hit. Not to die, but to end the waiting. Think about that. The man inside the torpedo tube, longing for silence, even if it meant never hearing again. Romanticism had drowned. Early in the war, these men were seen as elite, knights of the deep. But prestige curdled into paranoia. Dreams were replaced with hallucinations, and promotions? They just meant longer deployments and fewer odds of surfacing alive. Because by now, surfacing meant exposure, and exposure meant death. No air to breathe, no sun to see, just the thud, 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 until you couldn't tell if it was outside or your own pulse. What happens when even the best start breaking? The Battle of the Atlantic had become more than logistics and tactics. It was psychological attrition, a game of endurance, of isolation, of what it means to be human when humanity is buried 600 feet beneath. So I ask you, can courage survive in a place where even sound feels like betrayal? Because for many U-boat crews, the war ended not with a bang, but with a breath they could never take. And while the surface began to stabilize, beneath the waves, everything was unraveling. It wasn't glamorous. Stories like this deserve to be told. If you agree, hit the like button and help keep history alive. It didn't make headlines, but it won the war. The Atlantic Corridor, 5,000 miles of shifting sea between factories and front lines, wasn't just a supply route. It was a lifeline, and Churchill knew it. He called it the dominating factor of the entire war, because without food, without fuel, without steel, not a single Allied soldier would land in Europe. Now picture this, a Liberty ship groaning under the weight of ammunition, navigating icy waves while enemy periscopes lingered just beyond the fog. Its name? SS Stephen Hopkins. Its destination? North Africa. It never made it. Torpedoed at dawn, it sank in flames. But the story didn't end there. Gunner Richard Ogg, barely 22, stayed behind on deck, firing into the last shell. He delayed the U-boat long enough for the rest of the convoy to scatter. He never made it home, but because of him, others did. That is what logistics looks like in war. It's not neat, it's not televised, it's blood and diesel. It's choices made in silence. And behind those choices stood leaders with maps and migraines. General Eisenhower, for one, calculated everything, every gallon, every bullet, every shipment, because he knew delay one convoy, and D-Day itself wavers. He didn't just plan battles, he timed them like orchestra cues, and every note depended on men most history books forget, like the U.S. Merchant Marine, the unsung. They weren't soldiers, they didn't carry rifles, but proportionately, they died more than any other branch. They sailed knowing rescue was a myth. Why? Because without them, Normandy never happens. The tanks don't roll, the skies don't scream with Allied bombers. So let me ask you, can a war be won by those who never fire a shot? History says yes, because the Battle of the Atlantic was never just about sinking U-boats. It was about delivering boots, bread, and bullets. And every time one of those ships docked, the world tilted back toward victory. But arrogance would still cost lives, and one admiral's pride was about to turn the tide in reverse. From the polished floors of Allied war rooms, the future still smelled like gunpowder and glory. Big guns, big ships, big mistakes. Admiral Ernest King stood at the center of it all, a man carved from tradition, iron-jawed and unmoved. In his eyes, submarines were not tools of honor. They were sneaky, cowardly, unworthy of a navy that worshipped battleships. And that bias drowned men. Because while German U-boats tore through supply lines like wolves through cattle, Allied leadership clung to surface supremacy like a drowning man clings to gold. Convoys? King resisted them. He believed scattered ships would make harder targets. he was wrong. And by the time strategy finally caught up with reality, the Atlantic was already littered with steel graves. That's not theory, it's numbers. Between January and May of 1942, U-boats sank over 500 Allied vessels, most along the unguarded U.S. coast. The refusal to implement escorted convoys early wasn't just a miscalculation, it was negligence. And the cost? Cities like Halifax became floating morgues. Survivors arrived in blankets, eyes hollow, clutching nothing but silence. I still remember reading about Petty Officer Miles Cartwright. He served aboard the HMS Laurentic, torpedoed off the Irish coast. When he testified before Parliament in 1933, he didn't rage. He simply asked, "Why did we fight alone?" It wasn't a question of numbers. It was about trust. Because war doesn't only test firepower, it exposes the fault lines of belief. And the Allied belief in naval tradition delayed innovation that could have saved thousands. They believed the past was still the blueprint, but the Atlantic rewrote it. And every sailor lost to that misbelief is a footnote etched in rust at the ocean's floor. So I ask you, was Allied naval doctrine a strength or just a mirage inherited from past glories? Because sometimes the deadliest enemy is the one inside your own map room. And while the waves calmed above, beneath them the truth waited, silent, cold, and unforgiving. It didn't roar, it whispered. If you've made it this far, you're already part of this crew. Subscribe and like to keep these stories sailing into the future. And in that whisper, the fate of nations was sealed. The Battle of the Atlantic wasn't won in a single clash or a heroic last stand. It was won in cargo manifests, in decrypted codes, in the brittle minds of U-boat captains and the iron-willed silence of merchant sailors. Victory came not with a cheer, but a breath finally taken after years of drowning and uncertainty. Every calm wave held the memory of wreckage. Every safe convoy echoed the screams that had once pierced the same waters. There was no final explosion, no treaty signed on a deck, just a shift, a silence that no longer threatened, but healed. And yet, for all that, ask yourself this: would the Allies have liberated Europe if they had lost the Atlantic first? Because without that corridor, without that invisible victory, there is no Sicily, no Normandy, no Berlin in ruins. Only islands, isolated, waiting. The ocean, once a graveyard, became a bridge. And the men who built it, they didn't wear laurels. They wore oil, salt, and scars no one would ever see. History remembers the generals, the speeches, the stormed beaches. But before any of that, there was wolves, there was water, and there was a war that taught us sometimes the most decisive front is the one you never see. So tell me, would you have crossed that ocean knowing every wave could be your last?